Mayoral candidate Sarah Iannarone, thank you so much for joining us and spending a little time talking about some of your ideas, some of the things going on in the city, and ways for us to move forward as you vie for the place of the job of mayor of the city of Portland. Let's start by talking about something that is on your plate right now, which is reducing gun violence and some of the ideas you have for that, because we have seen a spike in gun violence recently here in the city.
This is one of those places where someone like me who operates in community, it may seem like an oversimplification, but our community members have already done so much work on this front that it's going to be relatively easy for me as the next mayor of Portland to come in, convene these people who are already doing the work, and make sure that we are putting our values into action through good policy. We need to make sure that what we're doing, even as we're dismantling the GVRT, is preventing our gun violence prevention programs from targeting Black and Indigenous Portlanders. We need to make sure that we're understanding gun violence to be a public health crisis so we can reallocate resources in that direction. Ultimately, it's about making sure that what we're doing is investing in stabilizing families and communities and centering the voices of those most affected.
Those gun violence teams often start with the same sentiment. They've been rebranded and moved around and added to different personnel and changed trainings forever. In various cities that I've worked in, what's to keep this one from kind of resorting back to business as usual and instead moving down a path toward change, like you were mentioning?
What I'm hearing from Portlanders is they want us to stop throwing good money after bad in hyper policing of communities. This is where a lot of the decisions that are being made are around, should we not be administering these programs out of the Portland Police Bureau? Do these need to be different kinds of task forces that are administered elsewhere? Should we be partnering with the county for the health aspects, with Portland Public Schools on the youth? What does it mean for us to actually listen to youth? The young people who've been building my gun violence reduction policy have been working on this for so many years that they started in middle school and now they're headed to college and they're building things that they want to see because what they've experienced their entire life are failed systems. And so this is a moment for transformative policy. We can spend potentially the same amount of money that we have been spending, but spend it in different ways based on what the community wants and maybe not what entrenched institutional actors have decided they need to perpetuate, over time.
I know these discussions are, in many ways, just starting. I mean, when you think about something this broad, I mean, even a series of weeks of talking about them can be looked at as just starting. But is there anything specific, maybe, that you can touch on that has been discussed that would be different than the traditional detective investigating a gun crime? What would be a different approach to bring gun violence down without using traditional means?
Yeah, it's really, ultimately what we're hearing from these students is they want investments in mental health safety. They want peer to peer interventions. They don't want militarized police interventions. They want to make sure that the investments that we're making are even to support families who have experienced gun violence so that the ripple effects, if you will, of those don't go outward into other members of their family, and that we actually have plans to stop the cycles of violence for people working on the ground. There are a lot of people who are returning citizens who've been formerly incarcerated, who have real life experience in whom we can be investing. Maybe not everyone who's doing this work is a Portland police officer. There can be a lot of different workers and different jobs created to administer these problems as well.
When you talk about like reallocating money, right? That's a big discussion right now. Where are our resources and our money being spent when it comes to what have been the duties of policing, but more or less keeping public safety a top priority? How do you how would you impact change, you think, as mayor with the police bureau? I know that you support Commissioner Joanne Hardesty as being the police commissioner. What do you think of Chief Chuck Lavelle? How's he been doing? Would you keep him on, or would you think of replacing him?
I don't know that I'm willing to comment on Chief Lavelle at this time. Obviously, he's doing a very difficult job that he was really thrown into in the midst of a crisis. And so I think all of us as Portlanders want to support him and see him succeed. ultimately the question is going to be on us as Portlanders of what do we want the future of public safety in Portland to look like? How do we want that budget? Half of our general fund goes to public safety. And when we're really looking at outcomes, when we're thinking about how do we keep Portlanders safe, it's about where are we spending money to help people experiencing intimate partner violence and domestic violence? How are we investing in, again, gun violence prevention programs? How are we making sure that police are held accountable when they misbehave, which is something that we have not seen, that equal enforcement. And one of the precepts of the Black Lives Matter movement is that, Black Portlanders and Black Americans do not feel that they've been held to the same standard as other Americans when it comes to law enforcement. And so I would ask, Chief Lavelle, can we work together on some of these things so that we really can bring Portlanders together in one place um, on a page? Also, I'm going to go right after I get off here with you. I'm going to go testify at the state legislature on things like tear gas limits. We need to not be using chemical weapons in the streets. Will he support IDs on uniforms is another thing that people in the public are calling for. What about a statewide database so that we can actually track law enforcement as they move from police department to police department across Oregon? Can we work on standardizing discipline measures across police departments in Oregon? I'm not a person, again, who goes it alone, and it's something that we've seen from the incumbent is that he tends to isolate himself and try to come up with the answers on his own. I think as Portlanders right now, we have to use our bully pulpit as the largest urban area in the state to lead, but we need to be cooperating with other jurisdictions so that all Oregonians are feeling safe at this critical time too. And I hope Chief Lavelle would be a leader on that, starting now, actually.
As we talk about leaders and the way they've reacted to this and the safety concerns that people have, I think that based on the folks who I talk to or comment into us after the show, safety is something that they're not feeling is being taken care of right now. They feel a little unsafe in the city, regardless of where they think that threat is coming from. And the police, including Chief Lavelle and other officers, have been critical of the silence from elected leaders to denounce the ongoing violence at some of these protests, at many of the protests as they go later in the evening, or minimizing property damage to single events like one little fire instead of ongoing 3 months of property damage and the toll that has taken on the city, not only financially, but when it comes to the reputation of the city and people's willingness from outside areas to come in and visit. Outside of the mayor or Commissioner Hardesty, how do you feel like our elected leaders have responded to this crisis, or at least been in front of it when it comes to speaking out or denouncing some of the violence we've seen at night?
We need to make sure that we are building the coalitions to solve these problems. I've seen wonderful statements made by Multnomah County Chair Deborah Kafori. Tina Kotek uh, issued a statement that was very thoughtful the other day. But we need to move beyond statements and get into policy reforms that are going to help us ease the tensions in the streets. I've been there denouncing violence, in particular police violence. I have failed to equate property damage with bodily harm, and I think it's important that we keep distinguishing those. They're both destructive, but we need to make sure that we don't conflate those. And, harm to human life and people who die in the streets is of a greater, we should be our focus right now, even as we don't want to see properties damaged. And ultimately, we need leaders who are going to be doubled down in the places where we are. I know that Governor Kate Brown lives not far from me over here. I don't see her moving from her neighborhood when things get tough. I know that I don't have the resources to move when things get tough in my neighborhood. But what we've seen from the mayor this week is that he's going to move from his neighborhood in an effort to solve uh, the, the civil unrest there. And I don't really think moving away is the answer when you've got problems. What you need to do is stay in place, bring people together, and really figure out how are we going to solve these issues. I don't believe that the unrest is going to end until we really get to addressing the police brutality that begets the protests in the first place.
I might want to interview one of his next door neighbors see how they feel about him moving out of that downtown condominium. I bet you they're excited that the mayor won't be drawing attention to the place where they lay their heads at night. Um,
But what are his new neighbors going to think? I
well,
mean, seriously, if the protests are going to follow the mayor, who's going to want him in their neighborhood?
that makes it a pretty tough place for him to find the right place to live, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Um, so so is that the mayor's fault, or is that the people who continue to go back to his apartment and stay in the lobby area or yell at people as they go in and out of the building?
You know, as someone who's anticipating being the future mayor, I want to be clear that I think Ted Wheeler is one of our neighbors as well. I wish him safety, and I wish that he would actually be doing better so that the people didn't feel the need to be protesting at his house in the first place. We're getting close to 100 days of protests, and you have to ask yourself, why is he in so far over his head that he has not been able to make any progress on this? And in many cases, it feels like perhaps we should be making headway, but is it getting worse? What is the problem there? I mean, he went on national television, admitted he'd failed because he's gone it alone, but I don't see the people stepping up in coalition beside him to solve this problem. I'm really not sure what the answer is. And until that answer, he's more clear about what he plans to do about this, I have a feeling that the protests will follow him, whether he's at City Hall, at home, or maybe trying to make a public appearance downtown. It's a very difficult situation for him to be in.
Well, some of the people who are on the more extreme end of the protesting have shouted him down, saying that they should abolish the police. We've spoken to several experts who talk about the extreme nature of that and how not only is it a demand that doesn't get a whole lot of broad social acceptance, but also doesn't make a whole lot of sense based on the way our society works. So when you have demands that are being that extreme, used as excuses for people to camp outside of someone's downtown apartment, how is it that he can be held responsible, or any of our leaders can be held responsible for meeting those types of demands when there's really no policing being done to keep people from being aggressive toward him because they're not being met?
I mean, they've shouted me down too, but I'm not the mayor, so it doesn't end up on TV, right? I mean, there are noisy people with strong feelings about what's going on all over the city. But what we have to think about is this: if we want peace, we need to broker that peace. And to broker that peace, we have to bring people together in meaningful ways with a commitment to shared problem solving and understanding that we're not going to all agree on what the path out of this looks like. But what we need to do is see agreement on the part of people who fail to come to the table, largely the Portland Police Bureau, in reining in their brutality. We've seen videos of police brutalizing demonstrators, medics, journalists, bystanders, night after night. And it is this violence, I believe, more than shouting down Mayor Wheeler or shouting down me, that is actually at the heart of what these protests are about.
Who would sit at that table? I mean, you've described the protests and the violence as a leaderless movement. So who would sit at the table on behalf of the people making demands and doing so by setting things on fire or barricading buildings or threatening police officers? Who who speaks for them?
We need to be centering the voices of Black Portlanders and Indigenous Portlanders and Portlanders of color at this time, but we also have to understand that those communities are not a monolith. And so, what that means is making sure that we have the relationships that are strong to know who are the true leaders in community, not just the figureheads who may show up and do interviews on TV or write op-ed pieces, but who really has influence in their community, who can be a person who comes to the table and speaks truly for community and then is able to then go back and be the arbiter of the process in their community. These are teachers, these are elders, these are business owners. They may not be the type of people who we've been bringing to the table for so long, the gatekeepers, if you will, who tend to put themselves at the center of the conversation. And this is why, as a mayor who's focused on anti-racist policymaking, who comes from a community-led mindset, even whether you're talking about small business development or climate justice or police reform, it's about knowing who to bring together and why, who are the best thinkers, who are the youth, who are the elders, to comprise that table. In some ways, it's about who are the outside thinkers, who are the creatives who are going to put that idea on the table that hasn't been considered before, that transforms things. So I think it's about thinking outside the box, it's about being inclusive, and it's about really knowing what does it mean to bring wisdom and experience and intellect and innovation together in a collaborative model to craft solutions for the future.
I noticed you didn't mention your name. Are
Well, I
you
would be the convener.
should you consider yourself a leader? Because I think often people compile many of the statements that you've made over the past few months and would probably put you in a category of someone who is viewed as a leader of the movement that we have seen.
I do not want to put myself as a leader of the Black Lives Matter movement. That is a Black-led movement, and I stand in solidarity with them always, and I will bring my platforms and my voice to support that movement. But what I'm running to be is the leader of Portland, and Portland contains multitudes of movements. We have so many people working on so many issues here. My job as a mom is to make sure that our schools are shored up. As someone who understands climate smart cities, is to make sure that we are tapped into global networks of resources that can help us make the transition off the fossil fuel economy faster and make sure our communities have access to broadband, to energy, right, to affordable housing. I need to support everyone in our city. And so my job, again, as the mayor, is to empower the community leaders, but not to put myself at the head of any movement, because ultimately, as the head of the city, I need to be there for all of the movements that are happening.
This is such a divisive time, and I think that often people considering the political landscape hear that but don't fully believe it. And I'm not saying that I don't. I'm saying that often people don't. And I'm going to refer to some comments here from Facebook, and I'm also going to put a little asterisk. These are not comments from Facebook are not where anybody should go for the specific definitions of how the world works. But these are comments that have been posted under things you have said specifically on your Facebook page, things that have been said on mine, as I mentioned that I was interviewing you today, things that people have written on other interviews you have done from various media outlets here in Portland. And I want to read them because they always kind of fit the same narrative. And this isn't accusatory at all, but I think that you should respond to them considering I read it so often. And I just kind of want people to be able to hear what you have to say about it and be able to put it to bed here. So Tony White said in an earlier interview, she, as in you, said that she wasn't the person lighting the fires and wouldn't condemn them. Really? ? Then Raymond Saperstein said, I have read that she is 100% Antifa. Linda Troop wrote, what is your association with the Antifa movement? And I'm going to read between the lines a little bit on those. I don't think that they're describing the simple stance against fascism, which is something that I think we should all endorse, but rather the people who are setting the fires, brawling in the streets with the Proud Boys, and committing other types of violent acts. Can you speak at all to these comments that I've seen time and time again under anything you say online?
Thanks for the opportunity to do that. If I tried to reply to them all individually, it would take me months, if not years. I condemn violence. I believe that violence is bad no matter who's doing it. And what I said was I understand that the people perpetrating that were angry, and rightfully so, and that I also saw that the Portland police were engaged in their own violence. But let's talk about Antifa sometimes, because I have said that I am anti-fascist, but I don't want to undermine the fact that we have a bumper sticker on my campaign that says everyday anti-fascist always. If you talk to our elders who were there for World War II, fascism is bad. I mean, being opposed to fascism should not be something that people shy away from in 2020. When we look at Trump sending unaccountable forces here who were scooping up people into vans, that is something to be scared of. And so when I say something like everyday anti-fascist, what that means to me is that every Portlander should come together to oppose bigotry and hate and exclusion and violence in our city. And even putting this into practice, I've put it into practice in very nonviolent ways. Last August, when we had the incursion of white nationalists from outside our city come in to incite riots and wreak havoc here, We did something called Tamp Out Hate on my campaign because we looked at the toxic masculinity that was driving a lot of this anger and rage that we see on display. And we collected menstrual products and then we distributed thousands of them to homeless shelters around the city. To me, that's what anti-fascism is. It's the kind community organizing that says hate is not welcome here, that a strong, cohesive community is ultimately our first responder in times of disaster, that when the going gets tough, we are there for each other. And the way that this has been weaponized against people like me, I think is indicative of what Trump begets in our society right now. And I agree with Mayor Wheeler that Trump is amplifying violence and making it unnecessarily worse. But to call anti fascism something a terrorist organization. It's just not true. And if you look at pictures of me or you search that hashtag, I'm generally dressed in colorful clothing, just like I am now, where I'm trying to bring people together in pro-social activities to make our city healthier and stronger, not to undermine anyone or commit acts of violence or hurt anyone in any way.
I think that they're also referring to maybe your unwillingness to be critical of a group that has kind of co-opted that anti-fascist movement, or at least are willing to use violent means in order to uphold those same beliefs.
When we look at the history of white nationalism, when we look at the KKK even, and when you look at law enforcement's historic uh, sympathizing, if you will, with white supremacy in the United States, what you have people saying is that we are not going to tolerate that kind of violence here. And they're responding to that. If there were no people who were white supremacists, if there were no white nationalist agitators, if there weren't this new KKK who were coming to be racist against Black Portlanders, who were anti-Semitic, right, against our Jewish community, they would be home growing tomatoes and microbrewing, right, beers. It's not, these people are not in this for fun. They're in this because they care about community and ultimately they want people to be safe too, is my understanding of where they're coming from when they talk about why they're doing what they're doing.
So when the Proud Boys and Patriot Prayer were here, not most recently, but the weekend before, and other supporters, they organized a rally. I think it was 2 weekends ago. They were met in the streets by many of the same people who we've seen clashing with police every single night. The two sides fought. They hit each other with bats. Somebody pulled a gun. There were lasers. Somebody from at least there was video showing somebody who was from the side represented by the Proud Boys and right wing, things like that, pulled a gun. There were lasers and mace and fists and a brawl in the street, and no one was arrested. Police said that they didn't have the resources to get involved. What was your impression of that?
I have to go, so many steps prior to that where I have seen time and again Portland Police Bureau stand with their backs to the white nationalists facing people who were there upholding civil rights, upholding equity, inclusion, and peace and justice in our city. And what we have not seen is equal enforcement of the law. I was at a climate march where the youth were not even allowed to cross the bridge with a police escort, even as weeks prior, the white nationalists had their own police escort across the very same bridge. And at that time, the police used excessive force with youth climate marchers. How can we say that we have equal enforcement of the law when white nationalist outsiders, they come from around the region in the Pacific Northwest to incite riots and cause violence in our city purposefully because they resent our progressivism when they are treated essentially with kid gloves by Portland police. And at the same time, police find infinite resources night after night after night to meet the Black Lives Matter demonstrators. It's the rhetoric doesn't hold when you actually look at the actions and expenditures and who gets criminalized when they're protesting in the street.
To be fair, police have used various tactics for various groups on various occasions. There hasn't been a set standard unless you are to, I guess, consider what the nightly protests have looked like as they kind of devolve late in the evening. And there have been some minor differences from night to night there as well. What do you think would be the fair treatment then? Should it be everyone with kid gloves? or should it be, what version of fair should apply to both sides?
What we learned in Europe is that we need to have zero tolerance for white nationalism. You know, when I think about Mayor Joe Anderson of Liverpool, when we took a best practices trip there, his staff came out and talked to us about the fact that he stood with his police against white nationalists, neo Nazis, and the alt right, because he understood, probably better than we do in the US, what that means for the future of their community, their country, right? And their coalition in the EU. And so, what do we have to think about as Portlanders when we're going to deploy our resources, our precious resources, including law enforcement, which we spend a great deal of money on? Should they be neutral in times of injustice? Right? Even Elizabeth Newman of the DHS had said the violence isn't perpetrated by Antifa. What we've seen is that the domestic terrorist threat again and again are the white nationalist agitators. They
They're
are
not, they're not,
purposely.
but they're not fighting with themselves.
Who's not fighting with themselves?
The white nationalists aren't. They're meeting, and there's an opposition meeting them in the streets.
But the reason, why are they coming to the streets? Why did the KKK used to put on white hoods and march with fire through the streets? And who met them? And who escorted them? Ultimately, when it comes right down to it, the antidote to this is not a militarized police presence or police brutality. It's a healthy democracy. And that's why when you look at my website, sarah2020.com, alongside my housing plan and my rethinking public safety plan and my climate justice plan, is something called good government. Because I knew even prior to this, even from the outset of this campaign over a year ago, that the healthy democracy was going to be the answer to so much of what we're facing. If we can't come together and elect officials that are representative of our people so that everyone feels their voice is included, to make sure the public process is accessible, to make sure that the budget process is democratic and inclusive, to make sure that people feel like government works for them. Do you realize how low people's perception of Portland government is right now? The dissatisfaction is immense. People do not feel like Portland works for them. We've lost the focus on why we're here and what we're supposed to be about. And so my goal is to get us refocused on a healthy democracy, make sure that our government is accountable and transparent, and clean up the city. And I believe that when we focus on those basics, when we go back to actually considering constituent services important, when the mayor's office cares about the complaints of everyday Portlanders, we're going to be on track to solving some of these larger, more ideological issues. But it's about the basics. We have to be able to talk to each other. We have to be able to deliberate and discuss and learn how to disagree and still come out the other side with progress.
What is your interpretation of zero tolerance for some of these groups that are linked to white nationalism? And I am by no means supporting white nationalism at all. I'm simply trying to understand your interpretation of the First Amendment when a group like the Proud Boys decides to march in Portland.
What we're seeing is people who are cloaking themselves in the Constitution, not really committed to upholding it. Because if they were, they would be decrying actually some of the egregious activities that the current president undertakes, right? He goes outside the Constitution constantly. So this is really about making sure that we are focused on health, safety, and well-being of Portlanders,
So what are you saying?
protecting.
Should we not allow them in the city? Should we stop their marches and say you're not allowed to come in here and do this?
You know, there are experts at Duke University who looked at existing laws on the books against paramilitary organizations and militias so that every state could actually begin enforcing the laws that are already on the books. Oregon has them. But we understand that the current mayor actually did not heed that advising and went a different path when he worked with then Chief Outlaw to come up with the dividing the groups strategy, which we ultimately in the community said we know that this is not going to work. What we need to do is not allow them permits when we know that the point of their activity here is to incite riots. What we need to do is think of creative solutions, think all the way back to the Vortex Festival, right? When we this is not the first time that our nation has found itself in civil unrest. Are there creative things that we could be doing with community investments all around the city that were pro-social, that were helping uplift communities and bring us together? What would it mean to have car-free weekends when we know that they're coming to downtown so that we don't see the vehicular um, threat that we've seen where people are using large trucks and other vehicles to ram into crowds and things like that. I mean, vehicular violence is a very real threat. So there are ways that we could use existing policies or other tools creatively. What we've decided to do, at least as far as I can see, is see policing as the answer. And as we have seen, that's not working.
But
Perhaps we
if
should try something new.
but if those tools were used against other protests, regardless, I mean, regardless of the what people stand for, um, as it's written in the Constitution, as long as they're not threatening people, as long as they're not hurting anyone or destroying anything or breaking any laws, you're allowed to say whatever you want. So you think that we should not let them drive, let people drive cars into the city, or that you should force them to get permits in order to have their First Amendment rights if they are standing for something as horrible as white supremacy.
Listen, white nationalism is an incitement to violence in its very ideology. It's not this good people on both sides. You can't yell fire in a crowded theater and call it okay, right? We've determined this as a society. And so to equate when climate youth are marching with white nationalist Proud Boys marching is a false binary. What we need to say is that when we see climate youth marching, that protecting their safety and well-being is of our utmost concern. When we see white nationalists marching, you are here to incite violence and you are not welcome. And we will use every legal tool at our disposal to do that. I have not seen us doing that. And I actually think car-free weekends are something that we could do just generally, right? This is not where we're trying to limit anyone's ability to move freely about our city, but perhaps Sunday nights after 8 p.m., it could be very easy to have a few car-free hours. And what that would do would help minimize the impact on local law enforcement, help minimize how we're having to address these various threats that are coming at us from different directions. Even Chief Lavelle himself said that they tried to mitigate the threat of the caravan of all, I think it was over 600 vehicles, and they didn't have the capacity. So imagine if that were a car-free evening and just, you know what, we're going to walk, bike, or use transit in downtown Portland that night. Well, that makes it easy because you can apply that equally to everyone.
I empathize with your disgust with white supremacy and white nationalism. But can you see how some of the things you are saying are also being applied to some of the violence that we're seeing in the evening as people are throwing things at police officers or trying to burn down buildings? And there was a person who was with the Patriot prayer, I believe, who was shot and killed in the street the other day. So we are seeing levels of violence from groups that would you apply the same policies to them? Would you make them abide by a curfew? Would you? We haven't heard any calls for the people involved in some of the violence at night to have any of these. You can't come into the city or any of the things that you are trying to apply to white nationalists. Even though there are a group of people out there who view what they're doing as violent and destructive and dangerous, and some of that violence they are blaming on someone's death at this point.
All violence is bad, regardless who does it. And what I'm calling for is equal enforcement of the law. Whoever killed that man should be held accountable. But you have to ask yourself, why have we gotten to this point? After 100 days of protest, people's temperatures are running hot in the streets. We should not be at this point. And this is, again, I put the blame back on Mayor Wheeler and the Portland Police Department for not acknowledging what needs to happen to stop what's going on in the streets. I've said time and again that I do not believe that the protests will stop until the police brutality is addressed. And what I have seen is a continued failure for almost 100 days to address that police brutality. This is where an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, and I continue to call for equal enforcement of the law. But we cannot even begin to start looking forward from a place of equal enforcement until we get to a baseline where we're not having violence in the streets, riots declared in the streets every single night after night after night, because ultimately what we're seeing is a cycle in which each night's protest is not even about something that happened 30 or 50 days ago, but a protest about the violence that they witnessed the night before. And I believe
Right.
that until we break that cycle, we're not going to make progress.
We've seen the white nationalists now engage. It took it took a few months, but we've seen the past couple of weekends, white nationalists came down. First, there was the brawl in the streets outside of the Justice Center, and then there was the caravan supporting President Trump that ended in an evening where somebody was shot and killed. As we've talked about all this violence, how it's escalated and affected the city, you have blamed white nationalists, you've blamed Mayor Wheeler, you blamed police. Is that as far as the blame goes?
I believe that if we make investments to shore up our communities so that vulnerable Portlanders are safe, Black Portlanders, Indigenous Portlanders, LGBTQ Portlanders, Jewish Portlanders against the threat of harm, and if we create an environment where people feel their voices are heard, where they don't feel economically disadvantaged, where they feel like they will have security and prosperity no matter who they are, what they look like, or what they believe, then we will not be a target for these white nationalists who have been emboldened by the Trump administration. And again, I will continue to put the focus on leadership because ultimately that's who bears the responsibility. And when I am mayor, I hope that people hold me to account the same way that I'm holding Mayor Wheeler to account. But his both sidesism is largely what got us here. There has not been a zero tolerance policy for hatred or bigotry in our city. We have not seen that equally enforced. And what the demonstrators in the streets are saying is that until that happens, until the police are held accountable for their brutality, Portland's going to continue to be in the national spotlight. This is a re-election stunt for Donald Trump. So what we have to do is do the best with what we have. And again, my solutions would be community oriented, pro-social, in some ways convivial, making sure that our people have alternatives to make it to being supported in the Black Lives Matter movement, to making sure that people have other outlets for their frustration and their anger. And ultimately, we would be, if I were mayor, I truly believe this, further down the pathway to meaningful reforms that other cities like Austin and Minneapolis have been able to accomplish because they took the demands of the protesters seriously a long time ago, months ago, and got their community processes underway.
It's amazing that we could talk for this long before, and I'm going to wrap up here quickly. I just before even getting into COVID, I mean, that just gives you an idea of what the city and country and state is dealing with right now. But a lot of businesses downtown have been suffering, at least in the area downtown closest to where a lot of the unrest has happened. We've seen a combination of the stigma of people not wanting to go down, vandalism. There has been COVID. Then, not to mention the economy, people struggling with making ends meet, and going out to dinner for some folks is not something that they're doing right now. But it extends way beyond just that downtown area. We're talking about a massive amount of the city and people struggling with keeping their businesses afloat. What are the plans in place, or what do you foresee happening to help people keep their businesses and start to thrive again as we hopefully sometime soon begin to bounce back from what COVID has done?
Yeah, this is where someone with my small business background, I think, is going to be so critical. When you think about the fact that I was able, back when my neighborhood was nicknamed Felony Flats and or Bethlehem, depending on who you talk to, was able to open a restaurant, which is actually a very hard business in that neighborhood, and get that off the ground. And ultimately, that business was robust until COVID shuttered it permanently. I have a good understanding of what it means to do community led small business revitalization all across the city. And I'm grateful that you didn't talk about this in terms of the protests shutting down downtown, because ultimately it is COVID that has had a great impact on our downtown. But even prior to that, we heard complaints from people who would go into Old Town Chinatown and even the Pearl District and were worried about the level of trash that they would see there. They were worried about the fact that there weren't restrooms for people experiencing homelessness or tourists for that matter. They were worried about the number of people they saw sleeping on the streets in tents. So I think this is something that has been building, but it's something that COVID has amplified and exacerbated, and now the protests compounded. But ultimately, we have to again look back at these very basics. What can we do so that no Portlander is sleeping on the street, on a tent, unsheltered? right? We've seen some inroads made with some of the emergency shelters in the Central East Side, the nickname C3PO for one, which is similar to Right to Dream 2. But can we use our resources more wisely, more strategically, and more widely distributed across the city so that we don't have people sleeping alongside our roads? Can we make investments in restrooms or come up with innovative ways like they've done in Edinburgh, where they actually pay small businesses, they help small businesses stay afloat by opening their restrooms to the public? Should we have things like, when we look at what's made Portland's downtown great historically, it's things like Pioneer Courthouse Square and Director Park and investments in public spaces and plazas. And so, should we be sponsoring, small business markets and expos and festivals, even festivals in the middle of the winter or at night, so that we're bringing people back to downtown, even if every single business isn't reopened, so that we can bring back the spirit of conviviality, cooperation and collaboration. And we know that when we make those investments, that there are spillover effects to the business community. And ultimately, I think a livable, vibrant, celebratory, even space in our downtown then becomes good for the financial sector and the other companies who have a lot of office space and things like that downtown, because it creates an environment where people want to invest, where their employees want to go, and ultimately we can begin to rebuild.
Anything more immediate for people who are worried about losing their life's work? Maybe not, and maybe not suffering homelessness because of it, but losing the business that they've sunk all of their time and money into for years and years of their life. Is there anything to immediately kind of protect people who are just now still hanging on and hoping to survive this pandemic with their business?
Yeah, I mean, as you know, as I said, the family business that I founded went under, and my ex-husband lost his job, my daughter lost her job. So we understand the impacts immediately, and what would have been helpful to them and what I'm hearing are helpful from small businesses all around Portland are two things, which are access to that capital and then access to the technical and other help that they need to make that capital really have power. And we don't control as much of the first part as we would want. I hope that more help is forthcoming from both the federal government and the state. But what I do know is this, that as the next mayor of Portland, I'm going to need to use every single dollar with the utmost efficiency. And as someone who's been a working mom, a small business founder who's had to do things on a shoestring for my entire life, I know that what that means is centralized operations. We saw our mayor had to convene a small business task force to deal with the COVID crisis. I really don't think that should be something that you're doing in the third year of your administration from day one. I've always proposed to have a small business liaison in my office who's administering and maintaining those relationships so that I understand at a moment's notice what needs to be happening in our city on that front, and making sure that those are then tracked as we deploy those resources strategically to best effect, that we're making sure that our BIPOC businesses aren't disproportionately negatively affected, that we're shoring them up. And ultimately, the recovery is going to take a while, but we need to keep our eyes on the prize, that we're not going to return to business as usual. What we're going to try to come up with is something that was better than we ever saw here before, because it won't be just white businesses prospering. We're going to make sure that there are business communities and corridors all over the city that are thriving. And ultimately, it's going to be about the hard work of rebuilding from a generation of displacement and lack of affordability and lack of community led development in our city that's going to get us back on track for the future.
How do you find the energy for all this? I'm just curious because you're a mom, you're a wife, you lost a business, you're going through the same troubles that everyone's going through when it comes to having to put a mask on every time you go to the grocery store. Um, you're running for office and putting your chips in line with changing things that have been so ingrained with this country for so many years that you understand the difficulty and the long road it takes to actually to make substantial change. How is it that you're able to do all of these things? And I'm sure there have been moments of personal weakness. If not, you're making me feel guilty about my own life. Um, I just wonder how somebody goes through all of this. I mean, because you're answering tough questions. You're having to balance kind of your own personal beliefs and what's best for the office of mayor, and running for the people as a whole rather than just the people who are specifically voting for you. How do you manage all of it?
Well, just to be clear, I'm not a wife, and I wish I were because then I would have help. I'm divorced, so I'm single and trying to go it alone. There's a couple of things. One, we're human, right? We're all human. I'm human. Mayor Wheeler's human. We all have problems in our life. I feel bad that he lost his mother in the midst of this crisis as well. Everybody's going through things. But I'm a mom, right? And I'm tough. And one thing that moms do is we gather to survive. I know that when I was first staying at home with my daughter, I thought I was going to lose my mind. So I started a childcare co op and a food exchange. And these are the things that I do to sustain myself. And so I'm not embedded in community or focused on community because it's something that I like. I'm embedded in community and focused on community because it's essential to my survival. I would not be where I am without community. I would have never beat cancer. I'm a cancer survivor. I would have never beat that without people feeding my family night after night after night while I underwent my treatments. I wouldn't survive trying to figure out how to rebuild my finances after divorce without help from my community. I mean, none of us exist in isolation, and what makes us stronger is when we connect with other people. And so when you ask what inspires me, it's because Portland is a place where community is so important to us. And I wouldn't rather be anywhere else because ultimately, when it comes to solving our biggest issues, it's going to be community that gets us there. And I'm so excited about that opportunity. And I feel honored that we're about to elect a people's mayor who's going to bring that power of community right back into City Hall and the center of that where it needs to be.
Sorry for my incorrect statement earlier. I thought you said your husband lost his job, so that's why I was
Oh, my ex-husband. That's
got it.
okay.
Yeah. I didn't know you were a
Don't
cancer
worry.
survivor. Man,
Yep.
you make me feel a little bit guilty because I kind of threw a hissy fit the other day at the house because I couldn't find my phone charger. So I feel like
Well,
you
I
have a
throw
little bit
hissy
more
fits
emotional
too.
control
It's
than
just
me.
my dog who hears them, right? So
Yes. Okay. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate your time as always. You always give us um, more time than you should. Honestly, you give us a lot of time, and I appreciate that. And you never shy away from difficult questions. So thank you for your time and your efforts. And we'll talk again soon.
best wishes to you and the family. Stay healthy and safe.
All right.